and available on. So now it is recorded and will be available on the YWCA's website. Is that right, Amy? That's where I found it before, I think.
On our YouTube channel.
On the YouTube channel. Okay, YWCA YouTube channel. Part of this event may be recorded and used by media outlets if they're here. At the end of the program, 7 p.m., our partner members will give announcements, although the participants are welcome to give announcements in the last half hour of unmoderated discussion, which we call the parking lot. We'd also like to recognize that we are meeting on the ancestral lands of Native nations. In Wisconsin, there are 11 federally recognized Native American sovereign nations and one seeking to regain federal recognition. We acknowledge these indigenous communities who have stewarded this land through the generations, and we pay respect to their elders, past and present. And here we go, Amy.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your schedule to join us. Much appreciated. Tonight's topic is the dangers of anti-Semitism. Neil has already gone through our 4 agreements. I just wanted to give a bit of background. We are so excited to be joined by Trent Spoolstra, who is the Associate Regional Director of Jewish Community and Young Leadership Engagement at the ADL. So for any in the meeting that are not familiar, the ADL, or Anti-Defamation League, is the leading anti-hate organization in the world. Founded in 1913, its timeless mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. Today, ADL continues to fight all forms of anti-Semitism and bias using innovation and partnership to drive impact. A global leader in combating anti-Semitism, countering extremists, and battling bigotry wherever and whenever it happens. ADL works to protect democracy and ensure a just and inclusive society for all. I'm going to yield the floor fully to Trent after we finish our first video. But Trent, is there anything in way of introductions that you want to share with our audience before we go into our first video?
No, just to say, Amy, thank you so much for inviting me to be here tonight. Thank you all very much for attending tonight, and definitely looking forward to Amy. She showed me some of the videos beforehand. I think it's great material in terms of really understanding a complex issue, but I think one that is nonetheless important to learn and understand. And I'm happy to join here tonight to engage in conversation, answer questions, maybe go a little bit deeper than where the videos go. So I appreciate being here tonight. Thank you.
Absolutely. And that is absolutely what we want to hear from you. And finding speakers is definitely a joint effort. Neil played an integral part, and we kind of, one reference led us to another. And again, Trent, we're so excited to have you join us here tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and begin with our first video. It's kind of, when I do the full screen, sometimes it cuts off. So I'm going to make the video as large as possible. So please bear with me until we regulate that, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazis killed about 6 million Jews and millions of other civilians throughout Europe. These are some who were slaughtered in the Holocaust. A generation lost forever. Jews are the people of the Hebrew Bible who lived in a land now known as Israel. They believe that there is only one God. Christianity emerged from Judaism. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew who preached a singular religious message. The first Christians were Jews who prayed in Hebrew and observed the customs and religious rituals of Judaism. The Last Supper was a Jewish religious meal, probably at Passover. Jesus was put to death at the hands of Roman authorities under Pontius Pilate in Judea, but the gospel accounts were interpreted as blaming all Jews for the crucifixion. To his followers, Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, his death, sacrificial atonement. Most Jews believed the Messiah had not yet come. Redemption was not at hand. Soon after the crucifixion, Roman armies destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Jews were exiled and scattered to live as a dispersed minority. By the 5th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. The early Christian church portrayed Jews as unwilling to accept the word of God. Illuminations showed Satan binding the eyes of the Jews. Some church leaders intensified the charge, condemning Jews as agents of the devil and murderers of God. The accusation was not renounced until the 1960s, when the Second Vatican Council officially repudiated the ancient charge that Jews had murdered Christ. For centuries, state and church laws restricted Jews, preventing them from owning land and holding public office. Guilds excluded Jews from most occupations, forcing them into pursuits like moneylending, trade, commerce. Excluded from Christian society, Jews maintained their religious and social customs. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem. Christian crusaders set off to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. On the way, they slaughtered thousands of Jews. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christians persecuted Jews. Portrayed as alien, Jews were regarded as usurers. It was said Jews poisoned the wells of Europe, causing the Black Plague. Illustrations depicted Jews as the devil, with horns and cloven feet, and showed them using the blood of Christian children in ritual sacrifices. These lies came to be taken as truth. But where they were needed, Jews were tolerated. When they were allowed to participate in the larger society, Jews thrived. In many places, secular and religious states forced Jews into segregated districts later called ghettos. England, France, Spain, Portugal, and many German states expelled masses of Jews, most of whom migrated eastward, taking with them their religious convictions and traditions. In 1517, Martin Luther attacked the Pope and corruption within his own Roman Catholic Church, beginning the Protestant Reformation. The young Luther hoped that tolerance would persuade Jews to convert. But when Jews adhered to their own religious beliefs and refused to join his new Reformed Church, Luther's disappointment turned to hatred. What then shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Their synagogues should be set on fire, and what does not burn must be covered over with earth, so that no man will ever see stone or cinder of them again. Their houses also should be razed and destroyed. All their prayer books should be taken from them. The Protestant Reformation brought no end to the anti-Jewish tradition of Christianity. With the 18th century Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, the domination of the church diminished. Some Enlightenment thinkers called for full rights for Jews, but only on the condition that they discard their religious customs. Others blamed Judaism as the source of irrational religious faith. Even though many Jews assimilated socially and culturally, prejudice did not disappear. In France in 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, the only Jewish member of the French Army's general staff, was convicted of passing military secrets to Germany. Later, proof of forgery confirmed his innocence, but Dreyfus remained the victim of a cover-up to divert attention from army corruption. A century after the French Revolution proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, giving Jews their freedom, frenzied mobs in the streets of Paris chanted, "Death to the Jews." Religious discrimination had gradually changed into a thriving secular, political, and social anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, freed from some restrictions, many Jews entered the Christian world and became prominent citizens. Then, around 1900, a new lie was promoted, that Jews conspired to dominate the world using their money and intelligence to manipulate trusting Christians. Russian secret police forged a document to support the story of a takeover plot supposedly authored by a conference of Jewish leaders. A proven forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was nevertheless translated into every major language and distributed worldwide. It is circulated even today, despite indisputable proof that it is a fake. To divert popular discontent at appalling living conditions and autocratic control, Russian authorities encouraged anti-Semitic violence. Jews were blamed for the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Pogroms, murderous rampages against Jews, erupted in Russia many times during the next 3 decades. The second half of the 19th century saw the emergence of yet another kind of anti-Semitism. At its core was the theory that Jews were not merely a religious group, but a separate race, Semites, set apart because of genetically inherited characteristics. Anti-Semites believed racial characteristics could not be overcome by assimilation or even conversion. Jews were said to be dangerous and threatening because of their, quote, Jewish blood. Anti-Semitic racism united pseudo-scientific theories with centuries-old anti-Jewish stereotypes. These ideas gained wide acceptance. The devastation of World War I, the demeaning peace of Versailles, the hyperinflation of the 1920s, and the depression of 1929 fueled mass discontent. The presence of Jews in German cultural, economic, and political life made them convenient scapegoats for Germany's misfortunes. Enter Adolf Hitler. Hitler viewed world history as a racial struggle for survival of the fittest. He saw Jews as the source of all evil, disease, social injustice, cultural decline, capitalism, and all forms of Marxism, especially communism. Anti-Semitism would become the predominant ideology of the Third Reich. Nazi racism victimized many groups of people, But it was against the Jews that the Nazi state mobilized all its resources for terror. After the Nazi takeover of power, anti-Jewish measures were put into effect one after another. Jewish businesses were boycotted, then seized. Jews were defined, separated from non-Jews. Jews were excluded from professions and studies. Jewish children were barred from schools. Jews were subjected to public humiliation. The changes, whether gradual or sudden, were incomprehensible. Few could imagine what would happen, even Jews. The Nazis took anti-Semitism to an unprecedented level of violence. Genocide, the systematic murder of millions of people deemed inferior. Six million Jews. These are some of them.
All right, so a lot to take in from that video. Trent, I'm going to yield the floor to you to get us started with the conversation. What things should we be really clear on paying attention to from that video? What insights were not included in the video that you think it's really important for us to understand?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Amy. I think the very first thing, and I'll mention this, actually, I'm a convert to Judaism. Actually, I converted as an adult about 7 or 8 years ago. And so I have a unique perspective within the Jewish community, because I remember, I'm proud to admit this, but I remember stereotypes that I held about Jews. And there are things I learned in school, or a lack of things that I didn't learn. And one of the things that I have since learned is that the Jewish people are very, very diverse. And I get it. I think the common misconceptions are that all Jews look a certain way, or all Jews are white, or all Jews are from New York, or they all came from Eastern Europe, or they all look like Jerry Seinfeld or the marvelous Mrs. Maisel, right? The fact is, there's a wide variety and a lot of diversity within the Jewish people. And so that's the only thing that I would add. I think the video did a fantastic job of explaining specifically about anti-Semitism that took place in Europe leading up to the Holocaust. But I also wanted to mention that there has been anti-Semitism across the Middle East. Anti-Semitism has existed here in the United States. So it's not just a European phenomena. It really is a worldwide phenomena. It just takes on different forms depending on which part of the world that you're in when it comes to anti-Semitism.
Perfect. So as people are gathering questions, we're going to follow our same rules as we always do. If you want to be called on to unmute, just put a question mark in the chat so I know who to call on when. If you want to type your question in the chat, I'll read that and we can respond. If you have anything that you think might be a little sensitive, you can direct message me. We'll deal with the content of the question, but not acknowledge the author. So again, same rules apply. And Trent, while people are thinking of their questions, either from the video or just questions they have about anti-Semitism in general, could you share with us a little bit about the work that you do at the ADL?
Yeah, absolutely. Would be happy to. I'll also mention as well too, pretty open book. So I know hopefully people, if you have a question, I mean, it takes a lot to offend me. So I'll just mention that as well too. So if you feel like, is this an offensive question? Like, I'd much rather answer it and hopefully give you an answer than to have you not speak up, right? But the thing is specifically with what I do at the Anti-Defamation League, I'm based here in our Midwest office, which is here in downtown Chicago. But I wear two hats at ADL, but the one hat that's relevant to this discussion tonight is Jewish community engagement, where I work with synagogues. I give a number of presentations to Jewish and non-Jewish audiences about the rise in anti-Semitism taking place here in the United States. Also, as a former teacher, I taught high school history before my current job here at ADL. I also give trainings to Jewish teens and college students on addressing anti-Semitism in everyday life and how it manifests, where it comes from, and tips on addressing it if they hopefully never have to experience, but when they do, even from things as simple as conversations to terrible things of their building or their Jewish sorority or fraternity being vandalized, and how do they address that if something like that were to happen. So a lot falls under the umbrella when it comes to Jewish community engagement.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So if there's anyone who has a question for Trent specifically, or if you have a comment about the video, or you want to use the video to frame discussion, please do go ahead and put those items in the chat or put a question mark on the chat, and I will know to call on you. So Trent, as we're waiting for those to come in,
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I got the message. In pulling videos for this discussion tonight, one theme that I kept coming across, and it'll be addressed further in the next video that we watch, are Jews a race? And the information that I'm hearing is no, not a race. One person referred to it more as they considered being a Jew similar to their ethnicity. Could you give some context around that, because it's a reoccurring question that comes up?
Great question, Amy. Absolutely. And I should mention as well too, it's still, if you were to ask two different Jewish people in the United States or Israel, wherever they may be, they might actually give you two different answers. And the reason being is that, and I'll get the question, is Judaism, are Jews a religion? Are they an ethnicity? Are they a nationality? Answer is all the above. In reality, I think the best way, at the end of the day, Jews are a tribe. And it's hard to, especially in the nation state world, the geopolitical world that we live in, it's kind of hard to understand like what, like in terms of tribe or things like that. I think the best way to understand Jews are a peoplehood. Jews are a nation in the sense of not a nation like America, a nation state, but a nation in the sense of individuals who share commonality together, basic beliefs and things like that together. And to illustrate that point, for instance, as we saw in the video, right, focused primarily on Eastern European Jews that were killed in the Holocaust, right? There are Jews that live in Latin America. There are Jews of African American descent. There are Jews of African descent. Good example are the Beta Israel community out of Ethiopia, right? And so when you have individuals who are from Eastern Europe, Ethiopia in this instance, Latin America, the United States, African American, these are people that have a wide range of either racial backgrounds, maybe socioeconomic backgrounds, but at the end of the day, they're all Jewish, right? They're all part of a peoplehood because we have certain customs and certain beliefs and certain heritages that go back together. So to answer the question about race, I don't think, given the basic definition of race, I don't think that really properly identifies who Jews are. Just to say, as are Jews an ethnicity? Well, I think for a number of Jews it is, but then you have other Jews, like it's their religion, or other Jews, it's their heritage, right? There are Jews who are atheists. And I used to have this thought as well too before I converted. People were like, well, how can you be an atheist? Jews are a religion, right? Well, the reason is because there are some people who identify it as their family customs or their heritage or their culture. So I think the best way, it depends on how you can pull 2 or 3 different Jews, and they might give you different opinions on what Judaism means to them. But in reality, it's a peoplehood. It's a collective.
Thank you so much for providing that context and kind of digging into the nuance. Dan, I saw that your hand was up earlier. Did you have something you wanted to share? If yes, please go ahead and unmute. All right. Well, Dan, if you did want to jump into the conversation, just raise your hand again, or again, put the question mark in the chat. Last call for questions before we go into our second video, which is entitled Black-Jewish Relations, Controversy, History, and Allyship. Billy Bob, go ahead.
Thank you to our guest tonight. After watching that short clip, I feel like I missed something in my life. Like I'm supposed to hate Jews. They're supposed to be bad people, and bada bing, bada boom. And I'm sitting here thinking, I don't know of a Jewish person that I hate. What's all this emotion all about? I don't know. I'm not even explaining myself right
No.
at the moment. But
I think I get what you're asking, really, right? And there are times I have to, as somebody who works at ADL and somebody who converted to Judaism, and Judaism is a part of my identity, there are times I have to take a step back and think, like, why do people hate us so much? And I think it's not a unique phenomena of individuals who are minorities or people in marginalized groups. I think it's the same. You can apply that same mentality to people of color, people of various sexual orientations, to immigrants. It's the other. It's people who don't look like us and people who don't think like us. And people, it can range anywhere from, honestly, a fascination to then when people view someone who is different from them as a threat, almost a threat to their way of life, a threat to their social standing, a threat to their livelihood, whatever it may be. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing such a large rise in hate in general, not just against Jews, but against a number of various groups of people, is that it's not a coincidence that when society is going through hardship, whether it's economic recessions, depressions, whether it's medical issues like COVID, whether it's wars, things like that, people jump to conclusions. And this is why conspiracy theories specifically become so commonplace, because it provides people with very simple answers that fit on oftentimes the narrative that they probably already had, but really just kind of confirms what they believe. And a lot of people who may not have never met Jewish people before or know a lot about Jews, they go online, they read about the Rothschilds and George Soros, and they read about great Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, and they say, oh, got the answer. Now I figured it out. It's the Jews who are behind it because they've done this in the history and this in the history and this in the history. And once people latch onto that idea, people who do latch onto it, it's very hard to backtrack and explain to folks that actually that's not the case. Just because this CEO is Jewish or this leader of this organization is Jewish does not mean there's a great Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. So yeah, I think I understand what you're asking. It's the same. It's a fear, it's an ignorance of the other, of who is deemed as the other in society, and people fear that. People hate groups like that, and they put their ills on other people to say it's their fault that things are happening the way they are in society or in my life in general.
So similar to that question, in the chat, and I'll read it in case everyone doesn't have the chat open. Considering the misinformation regarding Judaism, are there steps/groups in place to correct the large amount of misinformation that have been put out in the world. So Trent, I guess to kind of add on or summarize that question, how much energy does ADL put into chasing down misinformation and correcting it? Or do you have a different approach at ADL? What is the kind of the standard operating procedures that you use?
Sure, absolutely. And I'll actually put in the chat, we have an online resource to learn about anti-Semitism. And if you were to go to Google and type in ADL, it's called, just put it in the chat, it's called Antisemitism Uncovered. And it goes over a lot of the common myths or stereotypes that people about Jews that have existed for centuries in some cases. And we give facts to explain why those myths are incorrect, why those tropes, why those stereotypes are incorrect, or where they came from. So for instance, in the video, I'm glad the video explained this, which is people are going, oh, well, there must be a worldwide Jewish conspiracy. It's the Soros and the Rothschilds who had to take over the world. This idea of like Jewish conspiracy to take over the world comes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was produced over 100 years ago and has been debunked over and over and over again. Right. And people still believe it, honestly, because I think people want to believe it. There are groups of people you can present all the facts you want to them, and they're going to believe what they want to believe. At ADL, I think we take different approaches. Are the people who want to learn, as you all are here tonight, we're happy to do these presentations, or we go to schools, for instance, in K through 12 schools, and we have general anti-hate programming and teaching tolerance and diversity, things like that. For the folks who don't want to listen to us, the folks who really view us as a threat, people who are part of extremist groups or hate groups, so you can imagine we don't do a lot of dialogue with those groups because they don't really want to talk to us either. And with those groups, what we do is we monitor. ADL, we actually have analysts on hand. It's called our Center on Extremism. And we monitor hate groups on the far left and the far right to know what they're doing, what they're thinking. More importantly, when they cross the line from free speech to then committing acts of violence, we want to know, because we want to work with law enforcement or government officials. So it's kind of we take a two-pronged approach. Are there people out there who want to learn and are open and willing to learn? Or are there people out there who want to cause harm to Jews or to other marginalized groups? And with those groups, we protect ourselves from them. We try to monitor them. We partner with law enforcement and government officials to make sure that they don't cross the line and they commit hate crimes if we can.
No, I love that. I follow a similar model, like work with the willing. But I'm glad that you do have an arm of the ADL that does monitoring. I'm concerned about their mental well-being after absorbing all of that.
Yeah.
So hopefully there are practices in place to make sure that people are centering their wellness in that work. But yeah, unfortunately, it is necessary.
For sure. Actually, we have analysts all across the United States. One is based here in Chicago, is a good friend of mine. And we do things like, for instance, every once in a while, we'll go to bar trivia together. That's one of his things that he does every week. That's for people like that. And I admire our analysts. I get a little bit of it in my job, but I could not do that 24/7. But to your point, Amy, examples like that. He does that every Wednesday night. It's one of his go-tos. That's one of his ways, like, I got to get away from all this stuff, because otherwise it'll eat your life. Seeing a lot of hate. Yeah.
Right. Tell your friend thank you.
Absolutely. Yes.
For absorbing that for the benefit of so many. Much appreciated. So I see 2 question marks in the chat. We'll hear from Santo and then Edna.
Well, I want to thank Trent for joining us tonight and sharing your experiences. I don't have a question as much as I just have some statements. Can I do that? Is that okay with you, Amy?
Please.
I was raised in an Italian Jewish neighborhood in New York. So if you think about that experience, it has reinforced what you shared, Trent, about the diversity within the Jewish community. You know, from Orthodox Jews to Reform Jews to Jews for Jesus, and on. But it helps give me just a tremendous amount of respect for the Jewish people, Some consider it a religion, some consider it a culture, some consider it an ethnic group, some consider it a race, and it's like, wow, there's diversity within that group so much. And I also think it's a lesson to be learned on resilience, because I put it in the chat, but I'm thinking, I need to say this. They have probably been one of the most resilient, marginalized groups in the history of the world. I mean, we're talking thousands of years of marginalization, discrimination, the whole 9 yards. And I will never forget my mom. If my mom became your friend, she became your friend for life.
Yeah.
And Steffi Schmidt lived across the hall from us in the 9th-story apartment building in Brooklyn. And I was a young boy, like 4 and 5 at the time. And I remember going home and saying to my mom, "Mom, how come Steffi has numbers on her arm, but we don't?" And that was my first lesson about the Holocaust. Mom didn't use words like Holocaust, but she talked about how people who came from Stephanie's background were abused in the world, and they had numbers as a way of identifying them. And I thought, oh my gosh, how in the world, you talk about, it was kind of an exposure to a form of racism that as a 4 or 5-year-old kid, I had no idea.
Yeah.
But I remember Steffi died when she was 94, 95, and my mom was about 88, and she was in touch with Steffi until she died. She was out in California, and by then my mom was in Arizona. So I just needed to make a statement. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Santo. Edna, please go ahead and unmute.
Hello, everybody. I'm a born Jew in South America, 4 generations Argentinians. My grandfather's family, besides him and 2 sisters, perished in the Holocaust. I'm also an Israeli. And 2 things that I want to add to your beautiful explanation of what Jews are. Modern days are bringing into hate new definitions about what a Jew is. And I want to make clear that also not all the Jews are Zionists. Not all the Jews are 100% supporting Israel and anything that happened. There is a difference between Jewish and Israeli, because I'm both, so I can understand that. The problem that Santo you brought up about Jews for Jesus is that Jews for Jesus are not a Jewish part of Judaism, because we are still waiting for the Messiahs. And also our common past apparently is not the same as them. And I know that we respect everybody, but in the Jewish movement, Jews for Jesus is not considered a Jewish part of Judaism. We have the Reform, Orthodox, conservative, humanitarian, historian, feminist Jews, but we are still waiting for the Messiah. So that's my number one. I accept Jesus as a great prophet, and his learnings were very inspirational and very good in a lot of ways, but as a Jewish religion is not part of the Jewish movement. And I think that nowadays, another reason why the hatred of anti-Semitism, that is funny because Arabs are Semites too, but they are not included in this hatred, is mainly because people's ignorance doesn't separate between the Jew and the Israeli platforms, the Zionism and the historic national country ethnicity of what means to be Jew. I don't want to step on your toes because I know you know much more than me, but I see day after day, especially in small towns when people are not exposed to a lot of literature or they don't read much about things like that, that they use Jews and Israelis or Jews and Zionism as the same word. And I think it's very important because when you define a group by a wrong name, you promote hate. That's all what I want to say. But thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no, Edna, thank you for adding that. I'm glad that you touched on specifically, like talking about Israel, right? And I think it's an example, we would argue, more left-wing anti-Semitism that we've seen in certain, not all, but in certain progressive spaces in the United States, where people assume, oh, well, you're Jewish, and I'm glad you pointed this out. Oh, well, you're Jewish, you must support everything the Israeli government's doing because they're Jewish over there too, and you're Jewish, so you guys are basically the one and the same. And it's one of those things where it's like, no, to Edna's point, a wide range of opinion. When I say Jews are very diverse, I'm not just talking about racially or ethnically or also politically too. You'll find Jews who are Democrats. You'll find Jews who are Republicans. You'll find Jews who are very pro-Israel. You'll find Jews who are not at all pro-Israel. And it's an example of a stereotype that I think people have in certain circles of, oh, well, you're Jewish, you must support everything that Benjamin Netanyahu is doing in the government. Like, no, I don't.
So much nuance this evening. Fantastic dialogue. So we're going to add another layer. We're going to go into our second video. And two things I want to point out. One, something weird is going on with the videos. When I attempt to go full screen, it goes completely black and you can hear it, but can't see it. So I just need to widen it as much as possible so you can see the video. I'm going to commit to working on that, and hopefully I'll have that bug fixed by our May Courageous Conversations, but thank you for hanging in there with me. And then two, we're going to hear from a moderator and two professors. Both of them are Jewish. One of them used to be a professor at Fisk University. And for those of you that aren't familiar, because this adds context to the video, Fisk University is a private, historically Black liberal arts college in Nashville, Tennessee. Some of you may be familiar with it. But I just wanted to share that before we go into the video. The full video, I think, is right around 38 minutes. So I'll drop the link in the chat, but we're going to watch about 11 minutes of it, and then we'll rinse and repeat. We'll open the floor up for conversation.
To another episode of the Slice of the Community. I'm your host, Jerome Moore. Today, I'm with Dr. Meyer and Dr. Kendall from Vanderbilt University, who are both professors in the Jewish Studies Department at Vanderbilt University for our discussion here around Black and Jewish relations. Thank you all for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
I just want to preface it this way. Me and Dr. Kendall, we had amazing sidebar conversation at the United States and the Holocaust, which is kind of like the catalyst to this conversation. And with our conversation, it just opened up the whole nother world for me around just Black and Jewish relations. What does that mean? What does it look like? The history, the controversy, the allyship. So hopefully we can just dive into that and go straight into it. So I'll start with you, Dr. Meyer. Racism and anti-Semitism. How would you describe both of those being separate and similar?
I think in many ways they're very similar. The impulse for someone who is an anti-Semite or a racist is the same impulse to denigrate the other, to promote yourself by putting somebody else down. That general impulse, I think, is the same in all kinds of anti-whatever movements. It's obviously in America that the degree has been different. The way in which African Americans have been mistreated in America is greater than the degree to which Jews have been mistreated in America. But the impetus behind that mistreatment, I would say, is the same.
Okay, Dr. Kendall.
Well, when anti-Semites are attacking Jewish people or Jewish buildings, they're not stopping us first to ask whether we observe the kosher laws and don't eat pork, or we observe the Sabbath. You know, it's not based on religious grounds. They're targeting us because they see us as Jews, whether we identify as Jews or not. And in that sense, it's something that they're ascribing. If you go outside of the states and you think about the different ways that Jews have been othered, persecuted, oppressed, there have been contexts in which Jews have been persecuted on religious grounds. They were the wrong religion. There have been times and places where they've been persecuted on racial grounds and actually defined as a separate race and murdered because of that. Obviously, the Holocaust is the example.
We clearly sister girl, but she wanted me to
There are ways Semitism,
let him know
There are ways in which anti-Semitism is a form of racism. There are ways in which it's different from it as well. And if you think about the ways, even the Jewish community will talk about anti-Semitism, the Anti-Defamation League, for example, will talk about the number of anti-Semitic incidents. We talk about anti-Semitism in terms of something that you can count, incident by incident. We generally don't talk about racism in the States in terms of incidents. We talk about it as systemic and structural. And I think that we could pull back and we can talk about systemic structural dimensions to anti-Semitism historically and globally too, even though in the States we usually don't.
Right. And I wonder if we usually don't, because it's hard for me to say, you all are Jewish, right? It's easy for someone to look at me and say, you're Black, right? So when someone goes out their way to participate in being anti-Semitism, they have to do some digging. They have to identify, but definitely know, like, okay, that person is Jewish. Well, on the surface of a person of color, being of African American, I was like, okay, I can just be racist because I can definitely tell. I wonder, how does that play into the experience? And I'll start with you, Doctor.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Meyer can speak to some of this better than I can about white passing and the like. There are ways in which Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews are thought to have stereotypical Jewish looks. And it's interesting when you think about what the Nazis did. They thought that they could spot Jews very clearly, and yet they had to come up with a whole way of categorizing, where if one grandparent is Jewish, why? Because they couldn't tell.
Right.
So Jewishness is not a race. And yet it often gets talked about in terms of distinctive Jewish looks or behavior. I'm speaking with my hands right now. That's considered sometimes distinctive Jewish behavior. You know, so these things, they blend. But Jews have the ability well, we should talk about white passing. It gets into really, really complex questions about Jews and whiteness. And I think that can actually open us up to that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. My experience with my students at Fisk was that there was no distinction made between white people and Jews. I had been at Fisk for probably 10 years before I first taught a course in Black-Jewish relations. And students, several of whom I had already had in classes, were very surprised to learn that I was Jewish. And at that point in time, I'm talking in the 1990s, early 2000s, the distinction between Jews and other white people had kind of disappeared. Whereas in earlier time periods within the African community, there was a distinction made. I was telling Professor Kellner, the fact that there's a separate slang term, Goldberg, for Jews than there is for white people, Ophase or whatever, indicates that there's some difference, that African Americans see some difference. Now, whether that's a positive or negative, but they did see Jews as different than other white people. But I don't know that that's the case anymore. I think most people looking at Ashkenazic white Jews see them as white people.
I never thought that even the term like white Jews could be kind of cringing. Like, do I want to be associated with whiteness, you know, because of the history of just elite whites and what happened with kind of the persecution they put on Jews here, even in the United States, right? Up in the East New York and all those areas. And so that just fascinated me. Like, wow, you know, even though when I look at the census, like 92% of Jews, you know, classify themselves as white, you know, and okay, how does that balance then? When you walk into a room as a Jew, but you're white, everybody else is seeing you as probably white, right? But in your heart and your mind, it's like, no, I'm not. But it goes to that point too. Well, is being a Jew a race? You know, it makes it complex for someone looking outside in. But then to hear you say, well, it's definitely not a race.
Well, there are Jews in all races.
Yeah.
There are Jews in India, look like people in India. There are Jews in China, look like people in China. There are Jews in Africa. So if you break race categories the way I learned as a kid into those three categories, Jews are in all three. So it doesn't work.
So I want to get Dr. Meyer's opinion on this. Classifying it as white Jew, because we know there's Black Jews, you know. How does that make you feel? How does that initially hit you when I say, yeah, you know, if I said Black and white Jewish relations?
I guess that's mostly what I deal with is in my courses is those interactions. I think, again, in America, most Jews are Ashkenazic Jews who are white. Sometimes part of the problem between the two communities is that some people will take advantage of that, will use their whiteness as a way of promoting themselves, as a way of integrating themselves into whatever community they want to be in. by removing themselves and denigrating themselves from some other community.
Right.
I find that problematic.
Jewishness is categorized as whiteness here in the States at this present moment.
Right.
And it in different places and different times, it's been categorized differently. So if I look at the ship arrival records from my immigrant ancestors who came over under race and people, it says Hebrew there. And this is U.S. This is in English in a document that the U.S. government is using. It's 100 and some odd years old.
Right.
Now, at the same time, Jews in the South were drinking from fountains that were labeled as white. So they were categorized by the government for those purposes as white. So the Jews' relationship to whiteness is there's ambivalence, but it's not a totally fixed category.
Right.
And when you think about the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and this is by an avowed white nationalist, white supremacist who targeted Jews and did not see them as white. So Jews, on the one hand, Jews will enjoy the privileges of whiteness. So
Right.
Ashkenazi Jews will enjoy the privileges of whiteness, and at the same time are being targeted with violence by those people who are the most invested in some quote unquote white identity.
How do you all deal with that in everyday life? Walking into those rooms. And what are some of those things that you possibly may feel or don't feel? Or what maybe some of those advantages you have or don't have?
This was one of the most interesting things to me about teaching at Fisk for so long, was that I think it's very rare for white people, Jewish, non-Jewish white people in America, to be in a room where they're the only one in the room. And I was in that situation every day for years. And it affects, I come to see how a Black person would feel being the only one in a room, being the only white person in the room. Whether it's white Jewish or not, I don't think, again, that distinction makes that much difference.
Right.
I'm not a religious person. I consider being Jewish more like an ethnicity.
Okay.
But I think that I certainly, I'm not trying to deny it or anything like that, but I'm not outwardly telling people, hey, I'm a Jew.
Right. Have you seen any change in people's behaviors towards you once they find out that you're a Jew? Have you ever experienced that? Okay.
I don't think so.
Dr. McKinley?
Whiteness is not an identity that I embrace. I recognize that I benefit from privileges, right? That being categorized as white confers on me, right? So I own that.
Right.
But in terms of the identity that's important to me, it's the Jewish identity, and the notion of whiteness erases that. And if you think about Jewishness as a form of white passing, the whiteness is something that renders the Jewishness invisible. It's part of the assimilation of Jews into the States. But this is a culture that is important to me to maintain. And part of having it maintained is not just me identifying with it, but having it recognized by others as this is a distinct culture.
Right.
So it's an awkward and an ambivalent position, and also it's problematic because I do not want to affirm, I don't believe, and I really think it's dangerous also to say that Jewishness is a race. It's in the blood, it's in the biology.
Right.
I have a lot of problems with the DNA testing where people will say, oh, I'm 93% Ashkenazi Jewish. It's we after the Holocaust, we managed to expunge a racial discourse about Jews from American talking about Jews. That's come back in the conversation, and it's dangerous and it's problematic. So how do I, right, as someone who I'm categorized as white, I enjoy the privileges of whiteness, I am Jewish, I identify with the Jewishness, and I want to preserve this. How do I, in the States, manage to maintain and project an identity that says I am I want another category.
Right.
I want another category, and I don't. And a duality is problematic.
Is that a
All right. So there is a lot to unpack there. Elizabeth, I see that you put something in the chat. Did you want to go ahead and unmute? And then I'm gonna go to Trent and see what you found in that video that we should be paying close attention to, and then I have a question for you. But Elizabeth, thank you for being patient. Please go ahead and unmute.
I didn't put anything in the chat, so,
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
but I, have been reacting to things here. And for the most part, what people are saying makes sense to me. But Black-Jewish relations, there's a lot more to be said about that. I grew up in Chicago, and I don't know what I wouldn't characterize it as a problem here, but it certainly was a problem in Chicago.
Are you able to elaborate on that? And Trent, I see you nodding your head. Feel free to jump in, but for those of us
Yeah.
that may not be
Okay.
familiar.
I remember there's a very important newsletter or newspaper that Blacks have in Chicago. I can't remember the name of it. And it had a lot of anti-Semitism in it. But this, I'm talking about maybe the 60s or 50s, 60s. I'm not sure if that's true now. And I think part of that had to do with economics. So a lot of Jews had stores in Black neighborhoods, I think. And so, or they owned buildings that, where people are renting. So they became sort of the boss that people were angry at. I think that was part of it, maybe.
Okay. Thank you for providing that context. Trent, I'm going to hand the floor to you. And the thing that stood out for me was towards the end. And please respond to that and anything else in that second video. But when the professor directly across from the moderator, and they were kind of talking about intersectionality without saying the word intersectionality, but that he understood that he benefited from white privilege, but was very intentional that he didn't want his perceived whiteness to overshadow his Jewishness. And I thought that was really interesting. Is that an outlier in the work that you do from people's perspectives? Is that something that you hear frequently? What are you able to share on that topic?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Amy, kudos to you. I think that video was fantastic because there have been several books and articles and talks that have been done specifically on this topic alone. I mean, that could have been a whole topic for tonight in itself. And I think the video clip that you showed, I think really hit on the complexity of the relationship, because there are times when Jewish Americans and Black Americans have worked together and have shared similar struggles in the sense of there were times in America where Jews were not allowed to go to certain universities. They didn't care what your grades were. They didn't care what your SAT scores were. You're not coming here because you're Jewish. There were certain neighborhoods Jews were not allowed to move into. Like, we don't care how much money you have, you're Jewish, you're not allowed to move in here. So I think Jews at one point in America shared similar issues with African Americans. And then at the same time, as the professors pointed out, there a turn probably sometime in the mid-20th century, right? There was a turn where Jews started being perceived as being white in the United States, and Jews were allowed to start moving into neighborhoods that were previously excluded from, or going to universities that were excluded from. And then while that was taking place, African Americans oftentimes were still suffering from that gap, right? So there are it's a very complex relationship. There are times where African Americans and Jews have worked together. Civil rights movement is a perfect example. The founding of the NAACP is a perfect example. Oftentimes Jews were the ones that marched next to Dr. King, right? Perfect example as well too. There's a famous rabbi, Abraham Joshua Heschel, amazing Jewish scholar in the mid-20th century, marched and joined Dr. King numerous times. And then there are times when I would argue racism has existed in the Jewish community in the United States, and anti-Semitism has existed in the African American community, where tensions have risen as well too. It's almost, I think, a wave throughout American history of times when relations have been great, and then times when relations haven't been great, and certain events will take place that kind of change that course of where the current state of relations between these two groups of people are.
Yeah, and as you described it, with Black and Jewish people having some commonality with experience and oppression, and just think of what remains of that dynamic when the person you were in that oppression with maybe lifted for a certain degree for them, but not for you, and how does that impact the partnership? Susan, I see that you put a message in the chat. Did you want to go ahead and unmute?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I too was interested in that subject, and I wasn't hearing it being discussed much in the video. And another type of example of the animosity between two groups would be that I have seen and known in my own life are like Latinx and Black communities in school districts. They do show some animosity between them as both being underrepresented and marginalized as a competition for limited resources. And it's very sad to see it. It's very, I'm sure it's hard for all of the members of those groups, and it's ridiculous they're put in a place where that has to happen. But I mean, this is how things play out in our world that is very unjust and unfair.
Susan, thank you for sharing. Yeah, a lot of that has to do with your mindset as an individual, with the mindset of our institutions, and are we coming from a zero-sum perspective? So if you get that automatically means that I'm losing something.
Yes.
Instead of us thinking more broadly in when you succeed, I succeed, and how can we widen this pie, so to speak. So it's not a if you benefit, then I must be losing mindset.
Yes.
Perfect. All right.
And Amy, if I can add one more thing in, I'll throw another wrench in to make it even more confusing, which is when you go to Israel, for instance. I know Edna mentioned that she's Israeli. She probably speak on this a little bit better than I can, but I think the common misconception here in the United States that Jews are white. You can go to Israel right now, and I think people would be shocked. Almost half of Israelis, because you have a number of Jews that were either immigrated or honestly were forced out of Middle Eastern and North African countries like Morocco and Yemen and Iraq. We go to Israel right now, and actually about half of Israelis would be labeled as people who are non-white according to how we label whiteness here in the United States. So there's even that misconception too of you go to Israel, which is this, depending on numbers, either the largest or the second largest country that has the largest number of Jews, right? The way they address race, or the way American conceptions of race would go there, you have almost half of Israelis who would not be identified as white as we define it as here in the United States as well too. I think it shocks a lot of Americans if they were to go there and be like, this is a very Middle Eastern country, and be like, yeah, because you have a lot of Israelis who came from Arab countries or North African, Middle Eastern countries that either immigrated to Israel or oftentimes forced out.
No, really good point. I am going to put the link for the video that we just watched. Again, the full video is about 38 minutes. So please do feel free to go back and watch that in its entirety or share with others. Edna, I see that you have a question mark in the chat. Please go ahead and unmute.
Just to add to what Trent said, because I just came back from Israel 2 weeks ago, and the group of people that you're talking about are still marginalized in their own country. They're still are considered second-class citizens by a lot of them, even that they are part of the government that now is a disaster too. I was there during all the demonstrations, but Israel is a normal country like everybody else and has its own racist problems with his own ethnical people, besides the problem with the Palestinians. And they will tell you that it's not true, but those people still are feeling that way because of color. So yeah.
Trin, can you speak to some of the intentional work you do around partnership? And I believe that youth engagement is also in your title. Are you seeing that your work shifts depending on which generation you're dealing with? So if you could share some of that, that would be very useful.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll give an example. So actually, right before this meeting, I had a coffee meeting with an organization called JCUA. And one of the individuals there, she actually spoke. We had a board meeting about 2 or 3 weeks ago, right before Passover, and we talked about Jews of color, right? And individuals who are African American, who are Jewish, and their experiences. And to your point, Amy, it is and when I'm speaking to an older audience, I think the questions or their concerns are a bit different when I'm speaking to a younger audience, which is similar to the United States in general. Even in the American Jewish community, the American Jewish community is becoming much more racially diverse than it was historically. I think the professor pointed out, I think 85 to 90% of American Jews today are could be identified as white. That number is starting to decrease in the Jewish community because you have more Jews of color, African American descent, Arab descent, Latinx descent, right, who are now coming to the United States. And oftentimes, too, you will have, I think it might shock some people to realize that today in the United States, I believe over half of American Jewish children are being raised, if they're being raised in a 2-parent household, one of their parents is not Jewish. So you have kids who are, whether it's an racial household, inter-religious household, inter-ethnic household as well, too. So you have Jews who, various colors, ethnicities, backgrounds, heritage, et cetera, who are saying, no, I'm Jewish too. May not fit the specific mold that people think are Jewish, but we're Jewish as well too. So it's personally, I think it's a fantastic trend that we're seeing regarding younger generations of Jews, that another generation or two, I think the American Jewish community is going to look a lot more diverse than it does today.
A really great context. So Frank has a question in the chat, and again, I'll read it in case everyone doesn't have their chat open. Please discuss the fact that many people, including Jews, criticize the Israeli government's treatment of Palestinians. And does this criticism ever cross the line into anti-Semitism in your view? Sure. Yeah, Frank, great question. Similar to other questions tonight, I wish I give you a simple answer. It depends. And there's a lot of, to pick up on our variety, there's a lot of nuance here. I can speak from ADL's perspective specifically. So we are, like many mainstream Jewish organizations, we are a pro-Israel organization. We believe in both a Jewish and a democratic Israel. I would argue there are times when criticism of Israel can cross the line. I'll say this, I'll give it just kind of like basic examples. To say that somebody doesn't like the current Israeli government, that's not anti-Semitic. There are Jews, there are Israelis, as Edna has pointed out, that don't like the current government. That doesn't make them anti-Semitic. There are times, though, when I think the criticism of Israel can become so intense, or certain lines get crossed, or certain factors come into play where people it gets to the point where this is past criticism. It becomes anti-Semitic. I'll give a couple of examples according to ADL. Number one, I think denying Israel's right to exist as a country. It's one thing to say, I think the boundaries should change, the borders maybe should change a little bit. It's one thing to say, I don't like this policy or that policy. It's something to say completely, Israel is such a horrible country, just wipe it off the map, get rid of it. The problem with that is it denies Jews have an ancestral connection to the land of Israel, right? We can go into religious context, historical context, et cetera, but denying that Jews have a right to live in that land, I think is problematic, or saying we just need to get rid of Israel completely. It's way too problematic. That's an issue. Number two, and Ed and I have kind of talked about this, is assuming all Jews or giving collective guilt or collective responsibility for the actions of the Israeli government on American Jews. Good example of this happened actually here in the Chicagoland area 2 years ago. The last time Israel and Hamas were in conflict with one another, there were anti-Israel groups that they didn't go to the Israeli consulate.
right? Or they didn't protest. They found a synagogue down the street and said, we're going to direct our protest toward them because they're Jews in there, and therefore they must be pro-Israel. They have something, they're part to blame, right? Their mentality, they're partly to blame with what's going on. We're going to go to the synagogue down the street. That's an example of collective responsibility, collective guilt, right? It's like going to, that's like, for instance, I'm not sure if there's anybody Catholic on the call. It'd be like somebody disagreeing with the Pope or the Vatican's policy on something and saying, there's a Catholic church down the street. Let's go harass the Catholics who are there while they're at mass, right? Most people are like, that's idiotic. Why would you do that? That same mentality can apply to Jews going to a synagogue. And then number 3, according to ADL, kind of just a general rule, which is using caricatures, using offensive images to then criticize the Israeli government. One example would be criticizing an Israeli leader or somebody and saying, you know what, put a big hook nose on him and make his hair look really, really curly and kind of make him look demonic, make him kind of look like a goblin, right? That's bringing up images, caricatures that have been made about Jews for centuries and centuries, right? It would be like, I remember, so when Barack Obama was president, for instance, there were political cartoons that were very offensive. And there were people like, let's make him look like a monkey, right? Let's put big lips on him. Let's do that. Like, that's horrendous. It was horrible. That same mentality could be used against Jews as well, too. So those are a few examples. But like, to say that you don't like a certain Israeli policy, you don't like a certain Israeli, that doesn't make people anti-Semitic. At least here at ADL, we believe that.
And thank you for that clarification. So I am going to put in the chat actually a report by ADL, which is the audit of anti-Semitic incidences for 2022, which is going to be referenced in our last video. So for anyone, it's about a 40-page document. If anyone wanted to dig deeper into that, I wanted you to have that resource available as we go into our final video.
Amy, Teresa has a question mark.
Oh, okay. Teresa, go ahead and unmute, please.
Thank you, Neil. That was kind of you. I don't have anything super important to say, but I too have some background in Judaism. My mom converted when I was a toddler to Judaism, and so I grew up Jewish. And being white, I kind of fit in at school, but at the same time, I felt like an outsider a lot of the time, particularly at Christmas time. All the songs, everything, all the programs were all very Christmas focused. And there's nothing wrong with Christmas, but there's something wrong with it when you make the assumption that, well, all of these students must be Christian, right? And that wasn't the case. Thankfully, I had a good music teacher who incorporated some songs from Fiddler on the Roof into our music. As a teen, I moved to Israel and lived in Israel for 3.5 years. And just as Trent was saying and Edna was saying, there is such diversity in Israel. It was really surprising and just refreshing to see, my red-headed, freckle-faced kibbutz sister kind of looked a little bit like me, and yet she was Jewish like I was. So there were just so many differences from the Yemeni friend that I had who was very dark to, like I said, the red-haired and blonde friends who were Jewish. And when you're in a diverse group, and many of you have experienced diversity in big cities and such, you just start to forget. You don't really care. You as a Jew living there, I didn't think, are they Jewish or are they not Jewish? Just because you're there and everyone is, or there's Arab friends and Jewish friends, and they're both looking the same because one is a Sabra, Middle Eastern, and you don't think about it. But I returned to Christianity in my mid-20s, which is neither here nor there. I did not denounce my Judaism. It was just a choice I made. And I'm very thankful for my upbringing. As a teacher, I taught long-term music. So when it came time for the Christmas time programs, I made a point to not order the typical Christmas programs for the students. And I incorporated Jewish songs and songs about Kwanzaa and just diverse music into the programs. And I tried to encourage the other music teachers to do the same, but there's just this, and this comes into action. Like if we discuss later on, how do we take action? Well, if you are in a position to teach, be mindful of your students, that they aren't necessarily all Christian, or maybe if there are a lot of Christians, they need to learn more about diversity. So there's action that can be taken. The rise in anti-Semitism in general in America is, people are becoming more emboldened. Politicians make these references, as you were speaking about, Trent. It's very dangerous. We should be very, very alarmed by that, because it echoes Germany, early 1930s, mid 1930s. It's very dangerous, this path. That's what I have to say. Thank
Teresa,
you.
thank you for sharing. And Neil, thank you for not letting me miss that teamwork. So I'm going to go ahead and start our last video, which is the shortest of the three. I just put the link in the chat. It's just over 5 minutes long. So we'll watch that. We'll open the floor for discussion as we close, and go from there.
So I heard you had returned to Sanderson. So just choose your own destiny.
A new report by the Anti-Defamation League reveals anti-Semitic incidents increased 36% in 2022, reaching the highest level recorded in history since 1979. The report comes as the FBI and human rights groups warn about the growing number of hate crimes in the U.S. Jonathan Greenblatt is the CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League and joins us now. Thank you for being with us. And Jonathan, the ADL found in this report an increase in 3 categories. Assaults went up by 26%, incidents of harassment increased 29%, acts of vandalism rose by 52%. What accounts for it, and who is responsible for it?
Well, first of all, I would just say I'm glad we're covering this issue, but I wish we didn't have to. But the reality is anti-Semitism is a clear and present danger right here, right now in America. And as you pointed out, not only was 22 the highest year that we've ever seen, we've done this for almost 45 years. This was the 3rd time in the past 4 years that we broke a new record. Literally, the number of incidents has climbed almost 500% over the past decade. So what's behind this? I think number one, anti-Semitism has been normalized and almost weaponized in the political conversation and in sort of public debates. It's now just common course to use anti-Semitic tropes about great replacement theory, about who controls Congress or who controls Wall Street, who's responsible for COVID and on, in a world in which conspiracy theories are sort of the coin of the realm. Anti-Semitism, the oldest conspiracy theory, has new life. So I think that's number one. I think number two, we have to acknowledge that extremists feel emboldened. When the former president of the United States feels free to use the kind of language we would want our children to use, or to be honest, when we see hardened anti-Zionist activists on college campuses openly, aggressively, and almost gleefully intimidating Jewish students, something is broken in our society. And, truthfully, if you look at the numbers and drill down a bit, the numbers increased dramatically, a 40+% increase on college campuses, almost a 50% increase in anti-Semitic incidents at K through 12 schools. Again, I think it's an indication that there's something really sick with our society.
let's talk more about that, because I too was struck in reading this report about the 41% increase of anti-Semitic activity reported on college and university campuses. And doing more reading about it, what I learned was that Jewish students often say that harassment is often compounded when criticism of Israel arises. Tell me more about that.
Well, look, there's certainly nothing wrong with criticizing policies of the state of Israel. That's common course. That's what it means to live in a democracy. The ADL does that too. But the relentless obsession with the Jewish state, the claims that it's somehow committing genocide against Palestinians or responsible for white supremacy. If you think that a country, the only Jewish state in the world, is somehow white supremacist or somehow committing genocide, of course, we shouldn't be surprised then when swastikas show up on the Jewish fraternity, or when people feel it's okay to target and victimize openly Jewish students. So I think we've got to be able to distinguish between legitimate criticism and delegitimizing a country. That constant hackling and hassling and harassment, it's not unlike what we saw happen to Chinese American and Asian American students just a few years ago, when President Trump hammered and hammered and hammered on the Chinese virus or the Asian flu, and then Asian American people were targeted. The same thing happens here. It's wrong no matter who's perpetrating it.
The ADL is recommending that elected officials aggressively denounce anti-Semitism, also that the federal and state governments do more to prevent the spread of anti-Semitism online. In what ways? What does that work look like?
Well, first of all, you're making the right point here, which is we need a whole of society strategy to deal with this. It's not just something we can wait for government to solve or hope that a teacher or principal will do it. Everyone needs to be involved, because anti-Semitism isn't just a Jewish problem, just like racism isn't just the problem of Black people or homophobia, problem of LGBTQ people. Anti-Semitism is everyone's problem. It's a universal concern. So first and foremost, to tackle this, we do need people in public life, elected officials, policymakers, celebrities, to call out hate when it happens. But secondly, something else you referenced, social media. I would tell you that Facebook is a super spreader of stereotypes, and it amplifies anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. So we really think it's long overdue for some kind of government regulation, because, from Facebook to Twitter to TikTok to Instagram, the companies have proven again and again that they're incapable of regulating themselves, which means we need our elected officials to regulate them and force them to abide by a modicum of decency, just like we'd expect from any other media company.
Jonathan Greenblatt is the CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
All right, so as we bring our conversation to a close, I'm so glad that we could hear from the head of the ADL. Trent, any final things you want to leave us with? What can we do besides working to educate ourselves? What other tangible ways can we show up?
Absolutely, and I think there are a couple different ways, and actually I will include it in the chat right now. So there is a bill going through Congress right now that we are reaching out and we're asking people to support. It's called the HEAL Act, it stands for the Holocaust Education and Anti-Semitism Lessons Act. So last week, for those who may not know, last week there was a holiday called Yom HaShoah, which is it's celebrated, started in Israel. It's now observed by Jews worldwide. It's the holiday that commemorates the 6 million Jews that were murdered during the Holocaust. We are now 80 years, almost 80 years removed from World War II and the end of the Holocaust, and yet there are almost half of American states do not mandate Holocaust education. There are a number of states that actually, there's a study, ADL did not do it, another Jewish organization did it, that looked at millennials and Gen Z generations and asked them basic questions about the Holocaust. And there were large numbers that could not answer very basic questions about the Holocaust. And so one of the things that ADL we're not the only Jewish organization, but one that is working to say, please reach out to your members of Congress, ask them to support the HEAL Act. And you can go on Google right now, look up HEAL Act 2023. Essentially what the bill does is, of course, education is mandated at the state level, right? So we can't create a federal law. My understanding, can't create a federal law that says you have to teach about this. It has to go state by state. But one of the things that this bill does is it recommends to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., to conduct a national study to see where are we right now in terms of Holocaust education nationwide. And hopefully from that study, we can then recommend to various states of including certain programs, including certain curricula in Holocaust education, or for the 11 or 12 states that do not mandate it at all, like there's no commission, there's no task force looking at, like, just nothing, to consider starting to make those plans and move forward to mandating Holocaust education in the United States. Something super simple that can be done. I think that's one example. I think in terms of learning and education is that when you see something, to speak up and to report it, whether it's not just anti-Semitism, but hate in general, right? Because oftentimes, especially when it comes to right-wing groups, rarely do they just hate Jews. They also hate people of color and immigrants, people of various sexual orientations, people who don't think like them or believe in what they believe in. So oftentimes one of the things that we say at ADL is that Jews oftentimes are the canary in the coal mine, so to speak. We might be the first group, or one of the first groups that groups target. We will not be the last one. All right, so to speak up anytime you see hate take place, reaching out to law enforcement, reporting to ADL as well too. So like I said, not just about anti-Semitism or against the Jewish community, but against neighbors, against people that other individuals that you are friends with or community with that are minorities or are part of other marginalized groups as well too.
Trent, thank you so much, and thank you for agreeing to accept our invitation. You have definitely added to the conversation, and for that, we really appreciate your attendance and joining in. Trent and Teresa, I see that you have things in the chat. I'm going to ask that you hold those for the parking lot. Anyone who's new to Courageous Conversations that may not be familiar, the parking lot is the meeting after the meeting. It is not recorded, it's not moderated, but it's a space if we didn't get to everything, which some months we don't, which is good. You are welcome to stay another 30 minutes. Sometimes we leave a little early, so we just play it by ear. Neil does a great job of kind of helping us to navigate that. I do have one brief announcement. Some of you I know were able to join us for the Stand Against Racism event in Janesville last week. I almost said last month, last week, which we packed the house. There were people in the hallway. We did have to move inside because of weather, but it turned out well. We have one remaining Stand Against Racism event. It's coming up this Thursday, and this is our Beloit event. The weather, fingers crossed, knock on wood, is going to be great for Thursday, low 60s and partly cloudy. So we will be at the Harry Seymour Pavilion for our Beloit Stand Against Racism event this Thursday from noon to 1. I don't think our partners at Community Action are on the meeting, but Neil, are there any Diversity Action Team announcements that we need to be aware of?
Okay. Yes, I want to specifically invite people to come to the 21st and 25th anniversary annual meeting for Diversity Action Team, which is Thursday, May 11th, from 5:30 till 7:30 or 8. It's going to be in Beloit. You can find more information on the DAT website or on our Facebook page. So you're all invited. There is a cost to it because the meal is catered by Canute's, but it should be a fun and interesting time.
Perfect. So again, thank you everyone for spending part of your evening with us. I'm going to yield the floor to Neil. He will usher us into the unrecorded, I'll stop the recording in just a minute, and unmoderated parking lot. Thanks everyone.
Okay, I have a direct